Two towers once stood at the southern tip of Manhattan, rising 110 stories above the streets of the financial district. The North Tower climbed 1,368 feet into the sky. The South Tower reached 1,362. For a brief window, they were the tallest buildings on Earth, monuments to ambition on a scale that defied ordinary comprehension. Commentators called them the final grand gesture of the Rockefeller dynasty, a pair of steel and glass monoliths that redrew the skyline of the most photographed city in the world. That is the version of the story most people know. It is incomplete. Beneath the familiar narrative of architectural triumph lies a darker chapter, one involving the deliberate destruction of a neighborhood, the forced removal of hundreds of small businesses, and the deployment of government power to serve private interests. The World Trade Center did not rise from vacant land. It was erected on the remains of a place that powerful men decided the public had no reason to remember. When the Second World War ended in 1945, American cities entered an era of restless transformation. Returning veterans married, started families, and looked toward the suburbs. The great urban centers that had powered wartime production now had to find a new purpose. Not all of them managed the transition gracefully. Manhattan struggled most. Through the late 40s and into the 50s, corporate headquarters began abandoning Lower Manhattan for the leafy office parks of Connecticut and Westchester County. One by one, the firms that had occupied the financial district for generations packed up and departed. Buildings that had hummed with activity stood half empty. Property values fell. Tax revenues shrank. And New York confronted something it had never experienced before: the erosion of the economic bedrock on which the entire city depended. The damage was sharpest below Chambers Street. Lower, Manhattan had been built for a 19th century economy. Its narrow streets couldn't handle automobile traffic. Its aging buildings lacked the modern amenities that corporations now expected. Companies weighing the cost of renovation against the cost of relocation consistently chose to leave. Tucked into roughly 13 blocks between Cortlandt Street and Liberty Street, bounded by Church Street to the east and West Street along the Hudson, lay a district unlike anything else in the country. Over 5 decades, it had grown, without any central plan, into the largest electronics marketplace in the United States. Locals and visitors alike called it Radio Row. The shops were modest operations, repair counters that brought dead radios and flickering televisions back to life. Surplus dealers hawking military electronics left over from wartime. Component suppliers whose shelves held vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, and spools of wire in every conceivable gauge. Nearly all of these businesses were family operations. Many proprietors were immigrants or first-generation Americans who had built something durable from initial investments that could be counted in hundreds of dollars rather than thousands. The buildings themselves were plain, 4- and 5-story walk-ups, with workshops on the upper floors and storage rooms tucked under the eaves. Nothing about the architecture suggested grandeur. Everything about it worked. The structures served their purpose precisely because they were humble. Rents stayed low, and low rents allowed small operators to survive and even prosper. What made Radio Row irreplaceable was its density. Electronics hobbyists traveled from across the northeastern seaboard to walk its streets, knowing they could find a discontinued vacuum tube that no catalog still listed, or a surplus oscilloscope at a fraction of its original price. Shopkeepers carried deep technical knowledge in their heads, accumulated over decades of hands-on work. They'd spend an hour explaining circuit theory to a curious teenager. The neighborhood functioned as a living library of practical electronics knowledge, and the price of admission was simply walking through the door. The social bonds were just as essential as the commercial ones. Proprietors directed customers to competitors down the block, when they didn't stock the right part. Intelligence about suppliers and shifting market conditions circulated freely from store to store. Many of the current owners had started out as hired hands in other Radio Row shops before saving enough to hang their own shingles. The community was self-sustaining, self-governing, and profitable without requiring a dollar of outside investment. By the mid-50s, the district's businesses directly employed an estimated 30,000 people. Owners, skilled technicians, salespeople, delivery drivers, office staff. Annual sales ran into the tens of millions, and the shops paid property taxes, sales taxes, and payroll taxes that fed city coffers during years when those coffers badly needed filling. None of this registered with the men making plans for Lower Manhattan's future. To the urban planners and politicians who surveyed the district, Radio Row embodied precisely the kind of thing that needed clearing away. Old buildings, congested streets, small-scale enterprise. The neighborhood paid its taxes, but projected no image of a modern global capital. In their eyes, it was an obstacle, not an asset. Where city planners saw blight, David Rockefeller saw a transaction waiting to happen. He looked at those 13 blocks and envisioned not what they were, but what they could become once the current occupants were swept aside. He possessed something the shopkeepers did not: the money and the connections to turn that vision into reality. Born in 1915 as the youngest son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., David inherited not just wealth, but institutional power. Family fortune had been spread across banking, real estate, and philanthropic foundations so vast that the Rockefeller name functioned less as a surname than as a credential, an automatic key to rooms where ordinary rich men were not invited. He studied economics at Harvard, earned a doctorate at the University of Chicago, and served briefly in military intelligence during the war. By 1960, he was chairman and chief executive of Chase Manhattan, directing one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth from an office in the very financial district, whose decline threatened his real estate holdings. The family owned substantial property throughout Lower Manhattan. When values started falling, Rockefeller faced a choice: accept the slide and sell at a loss, or attempt something far more audacious. Reverse the decline through an intervention so massive it would require government authority that no private citizen was supposed to wield. In 1958, Rockefeller assembled a group he called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. The name sounded like a broad civic coalition. In practice, it was a private planning committee controlled by Rockefeller and a tight circle of fellow property owners whose portfolios would benefit directly from any redevelopment. The association commissioned studies. The studies reached conclusions that happened to align precisely with Rockefeller's interests. Lower Manhattan, the consultants reported, required dramatic transformation. Small businesses like the ones on Radio Row could never generate rents high enough to justify modern construction. The prescription was wholesale demolition and replacement. And the entity undertaking such a project would need legal powers far beyond what any private developer possessed. Rockefeller already knew where those powers resided. The Port of New York Authority had been created in 1921 as a bi-state agency answering jointly to the governors of New York and New Jersey. Over 4 decades, it had accumulated extraordinary legal tools. It could condemn private property through eminent domain. It could float bonds backed by future revenues rather than taxpayer guarantees. It operated outside local zoning restrictions. And it answered to governors, not to mayors or city councils. A distinction that insulated it from the kind of neighborhood-level political pressure that might have blocked a project like the one Rockefeller had in mind. In 1960, the Rockefeller family's leverage over the Port Authority became nearly total. David's brother Nelson was serving his second term as governor of New York. giving the family effective control over the state's half of the authority's governing board. The Port Authority, meanwhile, had recently completed most of its major transportation projects and was hunting for new work to justify its continued existence. Of all the sites evaluated in Lower Manhattan, Radio Row checked every box. 13 blocks against the Hudson River waterfront. Dramatic views, easy access to New Jersey through tunnels the Port Authority already controlled. Property acquisition costs would be comparatively low because the existing buildings were old. The businesses occupying those buildings were small and fragmented. No single wealthy opponent held large parcels that would complicate negotiations. Most useful of all, the neighborhood could be designated as blighted. That legal label was essential. Eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property, required a showing that the taking served a public purpose and that the area in question was somehow deficient. The definition of blight, however, was elastic enough to serve nearly any agenda. Old buildings with no central air conditioning and slow elevators could be called obsolete, even though the businesses inside them didn't need modern office amenities. What a vacuum tube dealer required was affordable rent and proximity to other dealers, not a high-speed elevator or a sealed climate control system. The blight studies ignored this distinction entirely. They measured the buildings against the standards of Class A office towers, found them wanting, and declared the area deficient. The conclusion had been written before the research began. Private capital wanted nothing to do with the project. Developers had studied Lower Manhattan and walked away. The financial risk was staggering, and no private firm was prepared to accept it. The city government was equally unable to help. New York was running chronic deficits. That left the Port Authority. It could issue revenue bonds backed by tolls from bridges and tunnels, giving it access to capital that neither the city nor any private developer could match. Austin Tobin had led the Port Authority as executive director for 2 decades. He understood an institutional truth that applied as much to government agencies as to corporations: grow or die. Without new construction to occupy its engineers and justify its budget, the authority would bleed talent, lose influence, and eventually face calls for dissolution. Rockefeller and Tobin began private talks in 1960. No public announcements, no community meetings. Both men operated on the same principle: design the plan in full before revealing it, so that by the time the public learns what's happening, the machinery is already in motion and opposition has no foothold. By 1961, the essential bargain was struck. The Port Authority would construct a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, anchored by twin towers tall enough to reclaim the title of tallest buildings in the world from the Empire State Building. The business owners found out from the newspapers. On January 28, 1960, the Port Authority and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association held a joint press conference unveiling plans for a World Trade Center on the site, bounded by Vesey Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Anyone who knew the neighborhood understood instantly. Radio Row had been sentenced. The press reacted largely with enthusiasm. Editorials celebrated the vision of sleek towers replacing aging blocks. The word repeated most often was progress. Buried in the coverage were passing references to the small shops that would be displaced. Several hundred businesses, several thousand jobs. Unfortunate but temporary casualties of a necessary modernization. Nobody from the Port Authority had contacted a single Radio Row merchant before the announcement. No advance notice, no invitation to comment. The first indication that these men and women would lose their livelihoods came from the morning edition. Oscar Nadell ran a radio parts shop on Cortlandt Street that his father had started. He'd inherited the business, expanded it, and raised a family on its proceeds. The building was nothing to look at. But the rent was manageable, and the location, surrounded by other electronics dealers, was the reason his customers kept coming back. Nadell read the announcement and felt the ground shift under him. His building was scheduled for demolition. Compensation would be set by appraisals conducted by the very agency that wanted his property. He would have no vote and no veto. The government had decided his shop stood in the way of the future. He got on the phone. Every proprietor he reached was asking the same questions. Could the Port Authority really do this? What were their rights? Could they fight the condemnation? The shopkeepers organized quickly, forming the Downtown West Businessmen's Association and pooling money for lawyers. The legal counsel they retained delivered a sobering assessment. The Port Authority's eminent domain powers were broad, and courts historically deferred to government claims of public purpose. Still, the lawyers identified a potential opening. The Port Authority's charter was rooted in transportation. Could luxury office towers plausibly be called a public purpose? The shopkeepers launched a dual campaign: legal challenges in court and a public relations offensive in the press. They invited journalists to tour Radio Row and see for themselves that the neighborhood was far from blighted. Stores full of merchandise, customers browsing the aisles, a community very much alive. The Port Authority countered by accelerating its schedule. Every day of delay gave the opposition time to build sympathy. Tobin pushed for rapid board approval, fast-tracked appraisals, and immediate condemnation filings. The machinery would outrun the resistance. By 1962, the contest was effectively decided. The shopkeepers had moral arguments and little else. They could file suits and hold press conferences, but they couldn't stop the bond issues, couldn't reverse the board votes, and couldn't overcome a legal doctrine that empowered the state to take property for broadly defined public purposes. The neighborhood was living on borrowed time. The Port Authority needed an architect of international stature, someone whose reputation would lend credibility to a project already generating controversy. They selected Minoru Yamasaki. The irony was layered. Yamasaki, born in Seattle in 1912 to Japanese immigrant parents, had watched his family lose everything during the Second World War when Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. His parents were sent to internment camps. He escaped only because he was already living in New York. The experience scarred him deeply. He'd seen firsthand what happened when a government decided that certain people's lives and property were expendable. Now he was being asked to design the crowning achievement of a project built on precisely the same logic. The commission required him to abandon nearly all of his convictions about humane architecture. The program was fixed before he arrived. 2 towers of 110 stories. Floor plates vast enough for corporate layouts. Exterior walls carrying the structural load so the interiors could remain column-free. The scale contradicted everything he believed. He accepted the job anyway. It was the largest architectural commission on Earth. Refusing it would have been professional self-destruction. Engineering drove the aesthetic as much as any artistic impulse. At 110 stories, wind loads became the dominant structural problem. Yamasaki and his engineers adopted a tube concept. The exterior walls themselves would function as the primary structure. 240 closely spaced aluminum-clad steel columns per tower, each 18 inches wide and set just 22 inches apart. The effect was a dense vertical lattice that made the facades look woven. The tight column spacing also produced narrow windows, which Yamasaki said served a psychological function. He reportedly suffered from a fear of heights, and the closely set mullions reduced the feeling of vertigo. The windows couldn't open. 50,000 workers across both buildings would labor in hermetically sealed enclosures, utterly dependent on mechanical systems for breathable air. Conventional elevator shafts serving 110 floors would have consumed the entire usable floor area. The solution was a sky lobby system. Express elevators carried passengers to transfer floors on the 44th and 78th stories, where they switched to local elevators serving specific ranges. The engineering was ingenious. The human experience it produced was something else entirely. Workers shuttled through transfer points in a daily routine that felt more like navigating a transit hub than entering a workplace. In his public remarks, Yamasaki discussed aesthetic refinement, proportional harmony, the play of light across aluminum surfaces. What the narrative left out was the neighborhood that had been erased to make room. And the architect never volunteered that information. While Yamasaki refined his drawings, the Radio Row merchants pressed their case in court. In 1962, they filed suit challenging the Port Authority's right to condemn their property. The central argument was straightforward. Constructing luxury office towers was not a public purpose. In March of 1963, the New York Court of Appeals sided with the Port Authority. The judges accepted that promoting international trade served a legitimate public interest. The shopkeepers' deeper objection, that the government was seizing their property to hand it to wealthier private parties, was set aside. The ruling extinguished their last legal hope. With the courts cleared, the Port Authority moved to appraise the properties. Assessors walked through Radio Row's buildings, examined leases and balance sheets, and produced valuations that systematically discounted what the owners were actually losing. The cost of finding new space, transporting inventory, and rebuilding a clientele from scratch was barely factored in. Nadel's shop was assessed at a fraction of what he believed it to be worth. Hundreds of others received the same news. The compensation was inadequate. The timeline was compressed, and they would be forced to sell and vacate within months. Going out of business sales liquidated inventory at a fraction of its value. Proprietors who had spent lifetimes building something were reduced to selling it off for pennies on the dollar. The community fragmented. Some shops relocated, but the clustering that had made Radio Row valuable couldn't be reproduced. Scattered across different neighborhoods, the businesses lost their gravitational pull. Wrecking crews moved in during March of 1966, starting on the eastern edge of the district and working methodically toward the river. Buildings that had stood for 70 or 80 years were reduced to rubble in a matter of days. Some displaced owners returned to watch. They stood on the far sidewalk in overcoats and suits, staring at mounds of brick and splintered wood that had been their life's work. Others couldn't bring themselves to come. Nadel was among the last to leave. He'd run his shop for 33 years. On a morning in April of 1966, marshals told him he had 2 hours to take what he could carry. He filled boxes with inventory, left most of it behind, and drove away as demolition crews prepared to pull down the building. Within a week, the structure was gone. The damage radiated far beyond the business owners. Each shop had employed technicians, salespeople, delivery drivers, and office staff. An estimated 30,000 jobs were directly tied to Radio Row. The Port Authority compensated owners and primary operators. The workers who depended on those businesses for their paychecks received nothing. The effects rippled outward through families. Mortgages went unpaid. Plans for children's education were shelved. Retirements were deferred or abandoned altogether. Radio Row had been one of the rare places where technical competence mattered more than surname or complexion. The district had provided economic mobility for people who faced discrimination everywhere else. When the neighborhood vanished, so did the latter. By December of 1966, most of the structures were gone. 13 blocks that had contained hundreds of buildings stood open. Nothing left but piles of masonry, concrete, and bent steel. The Port Authority conducted no archaeological survey, and commissioned no historical documentation. The demolished remains exceeded initial estimates. Hauling everything to New Jersey would cost millions. So the Port Authority pushed the rubble into the Hudson River along the site's western edge. Brick, concrete, wood, glass, all of it went into the water, creating roughly 23 acres of new landfill that extended Manhattan's shoreline. Battery Park City would eventually rise on this ground. The neighborhood that was destroyed to build the World Trade Center became, quite literally, the foundation for yet another development. David Rockefeller gave no interviews acknowledging what had been done. Austin Tobin avoided the subject entirely, and Yamasaki maintained the same silence. His writings about the towers never mentioned Radio Row or the people whose removal had made his commission possible. The moral questions were buried. What remained were technical ones, immense, complicated, and solvable with enough money and engineering talent. The site had to be excavated to bedrock 70 feet below street level, and the Hudson River, flowing just 300 feet to the west, could not be allowed to flood the hole. The answer was a slurry wall, a technique used in Europe but never attempted at this scale in the United States. Crews dug a perimeter trench around the 16-acre site, filling each segment with a thick slurry of water and bentonite, clay. When the trench reached bedrock, workers lowered steel reinforcement cages and pumped concrete to displace the slurry. The finished wall was 3 feet thick and 70 feet deep, a watertight barrier anchored in rock. Steel fabrication had been underway at mills in the Pacific Northwest. Prefabricated exterior column units, 3 columns joined together spanning 3 floors, each weighing roughly 22 tons. These were shipped by rail across the continent. The first steel was erected on the North Tower in August of 1968. The work was perilous. Iron workers operated at extreme heights in all weather, contending with unpredictable gusts. Safety equipment was primitive by later standards. The first fatality came in January of 1970, when Carl Coe, a 36-year-old iron worker, fell from the 44th floor, leaving a wife and children. The Port Authority issued statements about safety protocols. Work resumed the next morning. More deaths followed before construction was finished. By 1970, both towers were climbing above the Manhattan skyline, and the money was already running away from the original plan. The initial estimate of $280 million had been fantasy. By 1971, the projected total had reached roughly $600 million. By the time construction ended, the bill would exceed $900 million. The first tenant moved into the North Tower in December of 1970. It was the Port Authority itself, becoming its own first customer, a move that was both practical and quietly revealing. Outside tenants were not rushing to sign leases. The North Tower topped out in December of 1970. The South Tower reached its full 110 stories 7 months later, in July of 1971. The 2 towers now stood as the tallest buildings in the world, surpassing the Empire State Building after nearly 4 decades. The official dedication ceremony took place on April 4, 1973. Governor Rockefeller spoke. Port Authority commissioners delivered speeches about vision and achievement. Yamasaki attended. The narrative was triumph. The businesses destroyed and the jobs lost to clear the site received no acknowledgement. The towers were complete. They were the tallest on the planet, and almost nobody wanted to occupy them. The complex contained approximately 13.4 million square feet of office space, more than existed in some entire cities. Filling that volume in a market already glutted with vacancies would have been difficult under any circumstances. Filling it at premium rents in a district that corporate America considered unfashionable was close to impossible. Studies commissioned before construction had predicted brisk demand. The projections proved delusional. Corporations saw no reason to pay for the privilege of sitting in a building with World Trade Center on the lobby wall. Mid-1973, occupancy was dismal. The Port Authority filled its own floors to avoid the embarrassment of visibly empty buildings. New York State leased multiple stories, a favor arranged through Governor Rockefeller. Government agencies accounted for a large share of occupied space. The buildings meant to restore Lower Manhattan's prestige were being rejected by the corporations they'd been built to attract. Nearly $900 million in bonds needed servicing through rental income. But with occupancy below 50%, revenues fell far short. The Port Authority covered the gap by diverting money from bridge and tunnel operations. Commuters paying tolls were effectively subsidizing a failed real estate speculation. Critics began calling the towers Rockefeller's folly. The broader economy made everything worse. The 1973 oil crisis sent energy prices spiraling and pushed the country into recession. New York City itself was careening toward insolvency. By 1975, the city was effectively bankrupt. None of this encouraged companies to sign World Trade Center leases. Rockefeller's reputation took damage. He'd championed the towers as Lower Manhattan's salvation. Instead, the project had consumed $900 million, obliterated a functioning business district, and produced half-vacant office buildings draining Port Authority reserves. Slowly, grudgingly, the market came around. By the late 70s, occupancy began creeping upward, driven not by the blue-chip international firms Rockefeller had envisioned, but by smaller outfits attracted to reduced rents. Financial services companies that couldn't afford Midtown took floors. They signed leases. They paid rent. They kept the towers from becoming a total financial write-off. By 1980, occupancy had reached roughly 75%. Photographers included the towers in every cityscape. Films set in New York used them as establishing shots. Popular culture was gradually converting the buildings from a punchline into a landmark. What saved the towers, what transformed them from Rockefeller's miscalculation into objects of genuine affection, was nothing any planner had anticipated. It was sheer, stubborn presence. The buildings were enormous. They were there every morning. And over time, people simply absorbed them into the mental image of what New York looked like. The observation deck became one of the city's premier attractions. 2 million visitors a year rode to the 107th floor of the South Tower. Windows on the world, the restaurant perched atop the North Tower, offered expensive meals against a backdrop that no other dining room on Earth could match. The 1976 remake of King Kong used the South Tower as its climax. The giant ape scaling the building while helicopters circled, and embedded the towers in popular consciousness more effectively than any amount of Port Authority marketing could have achieved. When people around the world pictured New York, they increasingly pictured those two rectangular columns against the sky. By the mid-80s, occupancy had reached 90%. The towers functioned as ordinary office buildings, workplaces not monuments, and that ordinariness was itself a kind of success. Fritz Koenig's large bronze sphere on the plaza became a meeting point. Workers ate lunch in the open air. Street performers worked the crowds. The towers had also become symbols of American capitalism in ways that complicated whatever affection they inspired. To admirers, they represented ambition and national strength. To critics, they were monuments to corporate excess erected on the graves of small businesses. On February 26, 1993, a truck bomb detonated in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. 6 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. 50,000 workers evacuated down darkened stairwells in an operation that lasted hours. The towers were targets. Their symbolic stature made them attractive to anyone seeking to strike at the United States. In the aftermath, security was overhauled. Officials assured the public that the buildings were now safe. Operations returned to normal. The 1990s brought something the tower's creators had waited decades to see: unqualified commercial success. Occupancy held above 90%. Rental income was robust. The Port Authority had finally achieved the vision, a full generation later than planned. With a tenant mix that bore little resemblance to the original concept, but achieved nonetheless. By the year 2000, an entire generation had grown up knowing the Twin Towers as permanent features of the landscape. Children born after the dedication ceremony had no memory of the neighborhood that preceded them. Radio Row survived only in archives and in the fading recollections of people who had once worked its streets. Yamasaki had died in 1986 at the age of 73. The towers stood as his most famous work, though some critics argued they represented a betrayal of his humanist principles. He never publicly addressed the contradiction. The morning of September 11, 2001, was clear and blue. Approximately 50,000 people went to work in the towers. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59. The North Tower fell at 10:28. 2,753 people died at the World Trade Center site that day. Structures that had taken 7 years to build were gone in less than 2 hours. The attacks transformed the towers instantly from controversial office buildings into sacred ground. Everything that had come before, the demolished neighborhood, the inadequate compensation, the years of financial failure, was subsumed by the catastrophic scale of the loss. What mattered now was the dead. The site became a memorial. The footprints where the towers had stood were preserved as reflecting pools. The names of the victims were inscribed on bronze panels ringing the voids. One World Trade Center, completed on part of the original site and opened in November of 2014, rises 1,776 feet, taller than the towers it replaced. Its height a deliberate nod to the year of American independence. Radio Row is not mentioned in any of the memorial materials. The businesses that were destroyed to clear the site have no plaque and no marker. Oscar Nadell and the other shopkeepers who lost everything are absent from the official historical narrative. David Rockefeller died in March of 2017 at the age of 101. Obituaries praised his philanthropy and his decades of leadership at Chase Manhattan. The World Trade Center was cited as one of his signal accomplishments. The means by which the project had been realized were not discussed. The question the Radio Row merchants raised more than 60 years ago has never been satisfactorily answered. Does government have the right to seize private property from functioning businesses in order to build speculative real estate for other private interests? The court said yes. The towers rose. But whether that authority should have been exercised is a different matter from whether it could be. The Twin Towers stood for 28 years. In that span, they evolved from failure to fixture to symbol, becoming beloved despite their origins. The destruction of September 11th sanctified them in ways their builders never imagined. The darker story of how they came to exist was buried beneath a narrative of mourning and remembrance that left no room for uncomfortable questions. The Rockefeller empire that built them has dissolved. The neighborhood they displaced has been forgotten. The towers themselves survive only in photographs, in memory, and in the reflecting pools that mark the ground where they once stood. What persists are the questions they left behind. About power, about who decides what a city becomes, and about whether magnificence can ever justify the means required to achieve it.